Have you ever noticed how a man can love you deeply and yet slowly begin to retreat? Not because he stopped caring, not because he found someone else, but because something invisible began to suffocate the space between you. What if the very trait you believe proves your love is the one thing quietly pushing him away? There is a subtle psychological pattern that does not shout. It whispers. It hides beneath devotion, beneath closeness, beneath the longing to be chosen. And yet it carries the weight of fear. Tonight we are not looking at him. We are looking into the mirror of the unconscious. Because sometimes what makes loving men step back is not a lack of love. It is the presence of unconscious attachment. Beneath the visible behavior, beneath the careful text, the subtle questions, the tightening in the chest when he grows quiet, there is a movement that does not belong to the present moment. It feels present, urgent even, but its roots sink into older soil. The reaction seems proportional to what is happening now, yet something in it is ancient, something disproportionate, something that does not fully belong to the man in front of you. The conscious mind says, I just need reassurance. But the unconscious whispers, do not leave me again. This is the hidden psychological pattern. It is not neediness in the crude sense. It is fear, but not the kind you announce. It is the quiet fear of emotional disappearance, the fear of being unchosen, the fear of becoming invisible. And so the psyche develops a strategy. It learns to monitor tone. It becomes alert to shifts in energy. It reads pauses as signs. It becomes exquisitely sensitive to withdrawal, not because it is dramatic, but because it once survived something unpredictable. Perhaps love was inconsistent. Perhaps affection came and went like weather. Perhaps attention had to be earned, secured, protected. The child within adapted. But the child never stopped adapting. When closeness begins to feel uncertain, that inner child stirs, not loudly, not consciously. She does not announce herself. She moves beneath the surface, tightening the emotional field. Suddenly, love is no longer simple presence. It becomes vigilance. You feel it in the body first. A subtle contraction, a restless scanning, a need to close the gap quickly, to restore harmony immediately. The adult self may believe she is responding rationally, but the shadow has already entered the room. The shadow does not appear as darkness in obvious forms. It appears as righteousness, as justified concern, as I just care deeply. Yet beneath the caring lies a fusion, an unconscious merging where your emotional equilibrium becomes dependent on his constancy. In that moment, you are no longer two separate beings choosing each other. You are psychologically entangled, and something inside him senses it. Polarity in relationships is not merely sexual. It is psychological. It depends on two distinct centers of gravity. When one center begins orbiting the other, tension forms, not loud tension, but a subtle distortion, a loss of space. The atmosphere changes. Often this shift is invisible to the one experiencing it. From the inside, it feels like love intensified. From the outside, it can feel like pressure. The inner masculine principle within a woman becomes unsettled when her emotional ground is unstable. If her internal masculine is not integrated, she unconsciously seeks stability from the outer masculine. She reaches outward for structure, reassurance, containment. The man, sensing this, may begin to feel cast into a role larger than himself. Not partner, but regulator. Not lover, but anchor. He may not articulate this. He may not even understand it consciously, but he feels the weight. The pattern is subtle. The more fear rises, the more closeness is sought. The more closeness is sought from fear, the more autonomy feels threatened. The more autonomy feels threatened, the more he withdraws to reestablish space. The more he withdraws, the more fear intensifies. And beneath it all, a question trembles. Am I safe in your love? But safety cannot be extracted from another human being without cost. Projection deepens this dynamic. When the unconscious is activated, you do not see him clearly. You see him through the lens of previous absences. A delayed reply may carry the weight of childhood neglect. A quiet mood may echo an old emotional withdrawal from a parent. The psyche overlays the past onto the present with remarkable precision. You are no longer responding to him. You're responding to memory. This is the tragedy and the beauty of the unconscious. It seeks completion. It attempts to repair unfinished emotional stories by recreating them. The partner becomes symbolic. He is not just himself. He becomes the one who might finally stay, finally reassure, finally choose without wavering. But no living person can fully carry that archetypal expectation. And so, slowly, identity begins to blur. You adjust your tone to maintain harmony. You silence certain needs to avoid pushing him away. or you amplify needs, hoping they'll secure his presence. Either way, the center of gravity shifts. Your internal world becomes organized around his movements. This is where the loss begins. Not the loss of him, but the loss of yourself. The deeper fear of abandonment often hides an even deeper fear. The fear of standing alone within your own emotional landscape. The tension between attachment and autonomy becomes unbearable, and attachment usually wins. Because autonomy feels like risk. It feels like stepping into emptiness. Yet something in you knows. Something senses the imbalance. You may feel a quiet shame after moments of emotional urgency. A whisper that asks, why did that affect me so deeply? But rather than follow the question inward, the mind often turns outward again, searching for reassurance. The shadow thrives in what remains unexamined. If you were to sit quietly, without acting, without seeking contact, and simply observe the fear, what would you find? Perhaps not desperation, but grief. Perhaps not weakness, but a memory of standing alone too soon. There's no accusation here, only recognition. The hidden psychological pattern is not a flaw in character. It is an adaptation frozen in time. It once protected you. It once ensured connection. But now, in adult intimacy, it asks to be seen rather than enacted. When fear is unconscious, it moves the body before the mind understands it. When fear becomes conscious, something softens. The reaction slows. The space between stimulus and response widens. And in that widening space, a different possibility begins to flicker. Not detachment, not coldness, but a subtle reclaiming of inner ground. A sense that love can exist without fusion, that closeness does not require self-abandonment, that the inner child can be held without handing her to someone else to soothe. The pattern does not disappear overnight. It reveals itself layer by layer, especially in moments of perceived distance. But each time it is seen, truly seen, its grip loosens slightly, and in those quiet moments of awareness, the relationship shifts from unconscious reenactment towards something more deliberate, more spacious, as though the psyche itself is slowly remembering how to stand without clinging, how to love without dissolving. In every intimate bond, something older than personality begins to move. It is not merely two individuals meeting, it is two inner worlds stirring, two mythologies brushing against one another in the dark. Beneath the names, the histories, the visible traits, archetypal forces awaken. They do not ask permission, they simply rise. Within a woman, there lives the lover, open, receptive, desirous of union. She longs not only for touch, but for recognition. She carries the ancient memory of relational depth, of dissolving boundaries in shared presence. When she is centered, she is magnetic without effort. Her warmth invites, but does not grasp. She moves like water, shaping yet not clinging. But the lover is not alone within the psyche. Behind her, often hidden in the folds of the shadow, stands the abandoned child. She is small, vigilant, watchful for signs of departure. She remembers moments when love receded without explanation. She remembers silence that felt like exile, and though she may not speak directly, she breathes through the adult self. When intimacy deepens, it is not only the lover who awakens. The child awakens too. At first, their voices are intertwined. The desire for closeness feels pure. The wish for reassurance feels natural. But if you listen closely, beneath the tenderness, there may be a tremor, a subtle urgency, a fear that if connection loosens, something essential will collapse. This is where the archetypal field shifts. The outer man does not encounter only the conscious woman before him. He encounters her inner constellation, her lover, her child, her shadow, and within him, his own archetypes stir. His animus, or more precisely, his embodied masculine principle, seeks polarity. It seeks movement, space, direction. It is drawn to the feminine presence that feels grounded in itself, not dissolving into him. Polarity is not domination. It is tension between two distinct centers. Like charge poles, they attract because they are separate. When one pole begins to collapse inward, seeking fusion, the field destabilizes. If the abandoned child begins to lead the dance, the dynamic changes. Love becomes charged with survival. The lover's openness turns into subtle grasping. The invitation becomes expectation. The atmosphere thickens. He may not consciously register this shift, but he feels its weight. He feels that the space between them is narrowing in a way that leaves no room for breath. He senses that his presence is no longer simply desired. It is required for emotional equilibrium. and the masculine archetype, when placed in the role of emotional stabilizer for the unintegrated child, begins to retreat. Not because he does not care, but because the archetypal burden becomes too heavy. In these moments, projection intensifies. The woman may unconsciously project the image of the rescuer onto him, the one who will finally prove that love does not leave. He, in turn, may project onto her the image of the devouring mother, not literally, but symbolically, the force that consumes autonomy in the name of closeness. Neither projection is fully accurate, yet both feel real. The shadow operates quietly here. The woman may believe she is expressing devotion, yet hidden within that devotion may be the fear of standing alone. The man may believe he is simply needing space, yet hidden within his withdrawal may be his own fear of engulfment, perhaps rooted in early experiences of being emotionally overwhelmed. Two shadows meeting. The tragedy is not that archetypes arise. They are meant to. The tragedy occurs when they remain unconscious. When the abandoned child fuses with the lover, identity begins to blur. The woman may not notice when her mood becomes tethered to his responses. She may not see how her sense of self shifts subtly depending on his attention. Autonomy feels like distance. Distance feels like threat. And so the tension between attachment and autonomy sharpens. If she moves toward autonomy, the child panics. If she moves toward attachment, the polarity weakens. This inner conflict rarely reaches consciousness in clear language. It manifests instead as emotional intensity, as late-night overthinking, as a quiet erosion of inner ground. The animus within her, her internal masculine capacity for structure, direction, and self-containment, may remain underdeveloped. When this inner masculine is not integrated, she looks outward for stability. She seeks in him what has not yet been cultivated within. His groundedness becomes the pillar upon which her emotional world rests. But no archetype can carry another's unintegrated function indefinitely. When a man feels that he must be the container for both himself and her unprocessed fear, something instinctive shifts. He may step back, not dramatically, but subtly. A slight cooling, a reclaiming of space, an unconscious attempt to restore balance. And she, sensing this withdrawal, feels the ancient wound flare again. The dance intensifies. It is important to see that neither side is villain. Archetypes are not moral. They are forces. They seek expression, resolution, recognition. The lover seeks union. The child seeks safety. The masculine seeks autonomy and direction. Each carries truth. Each carries shadow. The question that lingers beneath the surface is not, why is he stepping back? But rather, which archetype is leading within me right now? When awareness begins to form around this question, something subtly shifts. The lover can separate from the child. The inner masculine can begin to take shape, offering containment from within rather than demanding it from without. The projections lose some of their intensity. The field between two people regains space. Polarity reemerges not through distance, but through differentiation. Yet this differentiation can feel frightening. To stand in oneself without leaning unconsciously on the other requires meeting the very fear that once shaped the pattern. It requires sitting with the child rather than projecting her onto the beloved. It requires allowing closeness without fusion, and space without catastrophe. And as this unfolds quietly within the psyche, the archetypal dance does not disappear. It becomes more conscious. The lover softens into presence rather than grasping. The masculine meets her without feeling cast into a role he did not choose. The child is felt, but not enacted. The relationship begins to feel less like survival and more like encounter. And in the stillness of that encounter, something ancient but newly integrated breeds, as though the unconscious itself is slowly reorganizing, learning to hold love without losing shape, learning to remain distinct without retreating into isolation. The movement continuing inward, almost imperceptibly. There is a moment in every deep attachment when the other person stops being merely themselves and begins to carry something larger. You feel it quietly. The tone of their voice holds more meaning than it should. A delayed response echoes longer than the present circumstance warrants. Their presence soothes in a way that feels disproportionate, almost medicinal. And their absence, even brief, stirs something far older than the relationship itself. This is the terrain of projection. Projection is not a flaw of character. It is the psyche's attempt to externalize what is not yet fully met within. What remains unconscious seeks an image. It seeks a face, a body, a voice upon which to rest. And so, without deliberate intention, you place parts of your inner world onto another human being. Perhaps he becomes the embodiment of security you once longed for. Perhaps he carries the promise that this time, love will not vanish. Perhaps he becomes the steady masculine presence your inner world has not yet consolidated. The animus within, your inner structure, direction, containment, may remain fragile or unformed, and so it is easier, more instinctive, to experience those qualities outside, rather than cultivate them within. At first, this feels like enchantment. Attraction carries a charge because archetypes are involved. You are not merely drawn to him, you are drawn to what he symbolizes. He is no longer just a man. He is the answer to a question you have been asking since childhood. Will someone stay? Will someone choose me without hesitation? Will someone hold steady when I feel uncertain? But he does not know he has been assigned this role. The shadow is active here. It hides the depth of your expectation even from yourself. Consciously, you may believe you simply love him. Unconsciously, you may be asking him to repair something that fractured long ago. The inner child, who once felt unseen or emotionally displaced, stirs when he draws close. She senses possibility. She whispers, maybe this time. And so the emotional field thickens. Projection begins subtly. You interpret his moods through the lens of your own fears. If he grows quiet, you do not simply register silence, you feel withdrawal. If he seeks space, you do not merely see autonomy, you feel abandonment. The present moment becomes infused with memory. Past and present blur until they are indistinguishable. This is emotional entanglement. When two people are no longer meeting each other as separate beings, but as carriers of each other's unresolved histories, the polarity that once felt magnetic begins to distort. True polarity requires differentiation. It thrives on the tension between two grounded centers. But projection collapses this tension. You lean inward, psychologically, tethering your emotional state to his responses. He feels a shift. He senses that his actions hold disproportionate weight. When your sense of stability rises and falls with his attention, he unconsciously feels responsible for regulating your inner world. This responsibility is heavy. He may not articulate it, but he feels watched in a subtle way. Not judged, watched. As though his emotional movements are being measured against an invisible standard. If he pulls away slightly to reclaim space, the field tightens. Your anxiety grows. He senses it. And the more he senses it, the more he may feel compelled to distance himself in order to breathe. Thus begins the cycle. The more you fear abandonment, the more you reach. The more you reach from fear, the more he experiences pressure. The more he feels pressure, the more he withdraws. And the more he withdraws, the more your original wound ignites. But what is truly happening beneath the stance? The psyche is attempting to complete an unfinished story. The inner child longs for a different ending. She projects her unmet needs onto the beloved, hoping he will respond differently than those who came before. The relationship becomes a stage upon which old dramas replay, not consciously, not maliciously, but archetypally. He becomes father, rescuer, stabilizer. You become child seeker, the one who must secure love before it disappears, and yet both of you are adults. The tragedy of projection is that it obscures reality. You do not see him fully. You see him through a veil of longing. And he, sensing this, may feel unseen in return. He may feel valued more for what he provides than for who he is. Even if your love is genuine, it becomes entangled with expectation. Emotional fusion intensifies the entanglement. You begin to lose track of where you end, and he begins. His mood becomes your mood. His distance becomes your distress. His reassurance becomes your oxygen. Gradually, your inner center shifts outward. Identity subtly reorganizes around him. This is the quiet erosion, not of love, but of self. The tension between attachment and autonomy sharpens. Part of you longs to hold him closer, to secure the bond. Another part senses that in doing so, something essential within you is dissolving. You may not have language for this. You simply feel exhausted, hyper-aware, overly sensitive to shifts in tone. And somewhere deeper, beneath the anxiety and the longing, lies grief. Grief for the moments when you first felt alone. Grief for the times you adapted too quickly. Grief for the parts of yourself that learned to fuse in order to survive. Projection continues until it is seen. Not condemned, not shamed, simply seen. When you begin to notice that the intensity you feel is larger than the present moment, awareness creates space. You begin to differentiate between him and the symbolic weight he carries. You sense the inner child stirring before she takes over. You recognize the shadow's influence before it shapes your perception entirely. In that subtle awareness, emotional entanglement loosens slightly. The beloved becomes more human, less mythic. The inner animus begins, almost imperceptibly, to strengthen, not as dominance, but as inner steadiness. The need to extract stability from him softens as you begin to sense the possibility of holding some of it within yourself. The tension does not disappear. The longing does not evaporate, but something shifts in the quality of the bond. It feels less like a reenactment and more like an encounter. Less like survival and more like choice. And as the projections gradually withdraw, what remains is both simpler and more complex. Two separate psyches standing before one another, no longer fused through unconscious need, but connected to a space that allows breath. A space where attachment and autonomy are not enemies, but opposing currents, learning, slowly, to coexist. There is a cost to loving unconsciously, though it does not announce itself at first. It does not arrive as catastrophe. It arrives as subtle compromise. A quiet rearranging of your inner furniture. A slow shifting of gravity from your own center into the orbit of another. Unconscious attachment rarely feels destructive in the beginning. It feels like devotion. It feels like closeness intensified. You think you are moving toward love, but beneath the tenderness there is a quiet transaction unfolding. I will bind myself to you so I do not lose you. The shadow stands behind this bargain. The shadow is not merely anger or resentment. It is the unexamined fear that shapes behavior while remaining unnamed. It is the part of you that believes love must be secured at any cost. It carries the memory of absence, the imprint of emotional unpredictability, the early lesson that connection can dissolve without warning. When the shadow remains unconscious, attachment becomes fused with survival. The inner child, once vigilant for signs of abandonment, continues her watch. She scans for changes in tone, in rhythm, in warmth. And when she senses even a slight withdrawal, something inside contracts. This contraction is not visible to the outside world, but inside it is seismic. You begin to adjust yourself in small ways. You soften opinions. You silence discomfort. You amplify sweetness. You become hyper-attuned to his moods, not out of generosity alone, but out of fear. Fear that if you misstep, something precious will fracture. The shadow cost begins here, the erosion of self in the name of preservation. You may not notice it immediately. After all, love involves compromise. But this is different. This is not mutual adaptation. It is self-abandonment disguised as harmony. The psyche quietly reorganizes around the other person's presence. Your emotional climate becomes dependent on his responsiveness. When he is warm, you bloom. When he is distant, you wither. Polarity weakens in this atmosphere. Psychological polarity requires two distinct identities, meeting across a charged space. But unconscious attachment collapses that space. It fuses, it clings. The tension that once created attraction dissolves into dependency. The relationship becomes less of a dance and more of a tether. And the more you tether yourself, the more the fear of losing him intensifies. It is paradoxical. The very strategy meant to prevent abandonment creates the conditions for it. When you lean too heavily, he feels the weight. When your inner stability depends on his constancy, he unconsciously senses the burden of being your anchor. The animus within you, your internal masculine structure, your capacity for inner containment, may remain underdeveloped or overshadowed by fear. Instead of holding yourself steady, you look outward for grounding. He becomes the pillar, and when a human being is turned into a pillar, he begins to feel less like a partner and more like a responsibility. This is where the shadow cost deepens. Resentment begins to gather in hidden places. Not necessarily resentment toward him, but toward yourself. A quiet shame may arise after moments of emotional urgency. You wonder why you reacted so strongly, why a delayed message felt like betrayal, why a simple request for space felt like impending loss. The unconscious fear of abandonment does not tolerate ambiguity. It demands certainty. But no living relationship offers absolute certainty, and so you oscillate between closeness and anxiety, between fusion and fear, between wanting to be held and fearing you are too much. The identity loss is gradual. You begin to forget what you enjoy independent of him. Your plans shift around his availability. Your inner dialogue becomes saturated with interpretations of his behavior. The world narrows. This narrowing is subtle but profound. Your life energy, which once flowed outward into creativity, friendships, solitude, now funnels toward monitoring the bond. The relationship becomes the axis upon which your sense of worth turns, and somewhere within, a deeper part of you watches. It watches as the lover archetype, once radiant and sovereign, merges with the abandoned child. It watches as the line between desire and desperation blurs. It watches as your autonomy trembles under the weight of attachment. This inner witness does not accuse. It simply observes. It senses the imbalance between attachment and autonomy. It feels the strain of maintaining closeness at the expense of selfhood. The tension between these two forces, the longing to merge and the need to remain whole, creates psychological fatigue. You may feel drained without knowing why. The effort to maintain connection becomes exhausting because it is fueled by fear rather than freedom. Unconscious attachment also distorts perception. Projection intensifies. You may begin to interpret neutral behavior as threat. You may see signs of withdrawal where none were intended. The shadow paints the world in colors of loss, and because the fear is unacknowledged, it feels like truth. Meanwhile, he senses something intangible shifting. He may not articulate it in psychological language. He may simply feel that the air has grown heavier, that spontaneity has been replaced by tension, that the relationship feels less like an encounter between two adults and more like an emotional obligation. This is the quiet unraveling. It is not dramatic. It does not explode. It slowly erodes intimacy from within. Because intimacy requires freedom. It requires the ability to stand alone while choosing to stand together. When attachment is unconscious, standing alone feels impossible. Yet beneath the fear, beneath the clinging, beneath the shadow strategies, there is a deeper movement waiting, a movement toward integration, not detachment, not coldness, but a reclaiming of inner ground, the animus within slowly awakening, the inner child gradually being recognized rather than projected. The love is dobring and embraced to Burberry. Its movement is subtle. It does not announce itself with declaration. It begins in moments of awareness, in the pause before reacting, in the recognition that the intensity you feel belongs partly to the past, in the realization that you are not as fragile as the shadow suggests. The cost of unconscious attachment is a loss of self, but the recognition of that loss is the beginning of something quieter, something more grounded. And in the dim light of that recognition, you may begin to sense that love does not require self-erasure, that closeness can exist without collapse, that autonomy and intimacy are not enemies, but opposing currents within the same deep water, still learning how to flow without drowning each other. There comes a moment, often silent, when the inner landscape begins to stir with recognition. It is not dramatic, nor heralded by clarity of thought. It arrives as a quiet noticing, a subtle awareness that the threads of your attachments are woven not only with love, but with shadows you have yet to meet. The inner child, who has long clung to presence and reassurance, trembles as if sensing the possibility of being held without needing to hold onto another for survival. And within the depths of your psyche, the lover and the shadows sit together, observing, waiting for acknowledgement. Individuation does not announce itself. It whispers. It arises when the projections you have laid upon others begin to reflect back to you the unclaimed parts of yourself. The man you have leaned on, the one whose presence once felt necessary to your equilibrium, begins to mirror not just his own nature, but the contours of your unintegrated fear. Each withdrawal, each moment of silence, each subtle distance is less about him and more about what you have yet to claim within. The parts of yourself that have been given over to attachment, the inner structures left undeveloped, the animus unformed, the strength you expected from outside now quietly demanding recognition within. In the presence of this mirror, awareness slowly expands. You begin to perceive the difference between what belongs to him and what belongs to the echo of absence inside you. The inner child's vigilance softens, not because it has been silenced, but because it has been acknowledged. You sense her fear without needing to act on it. You feel the pull of the shadow without merging into it. The lover within you stretches into presence, aware of the other's boundaries, aware of her own, and yet still capable of openness. Emotional sovereignty begins to emerge, not as defiance, but as recognition. That the center of gravity for your being need not reside outside. That love need not be conflated with survival. The path toward integration is quiet and serpentine. It winds through the tangled forest of past attachments and projected needs. Here, in the still spaces, you encounter the parts of yourself that have been hidden or disowned. You notice the subtle patterns of fusion, the moments when you sought to stabilize your world for another. You see how fear once masqueraded as care, how dependency once disguised itself as devotion. And as you look, the edges of projection begin to dissolve. The beloved becomes human, no longer a vessel for your unclaimed emotional reality, and you become a witness to the living truth of your own psyche. In this awakening, polarity regains its depth, not the polarity of desire alone, but the psychological tension that arises when two centers meet, each grounded, each sovereign. The masculine presence within and outside is no longer asked to compensate for what has not yet been claimed. The inner feminine is no longer collapsing in order to secure him. Instead, there is an oscillation between closeness and distance, between attachment and autonomy, a rhythm that does not threaten survival but allows intimacy to breathe. You begin to recognize the subtle architecture of emotional space, how it supports connection rather than consuming it. Fear of abandonment, once a tyrant whispering in every pause and hesitation, shifts its tone. It becomes a signal rather than a master, a question rather than a demand. You feel it rise, acknowledge it, and yet do not allow it to dictate the movement of your psyche. The inner child, sensing that presence and recognition are possible within the self, can rest in a new kind of trust. Not trust of another to hold her, but trust in the continuity of your own being. Integration is not absence of shadow. The shadow does not vanish. It breathes beside you. It is recognized as part of the same consciousness that longs for connection, that seeks love, that has feared loss. You feel the weight of what has been unconscious without needing to project it outward. You sense how patterns of fusion once undermine the polarity and the aliveness between yourself and another. You begin to distinguish between the magnetic pull of true intimacy and the gripping force of unresolved fear. And in this subtle unfolding, identity returns, quietly but insistently. The parts of you that were suspended in the orbit of another begin to reclaim their place within. The inner masculine becomes a presence of containment and direction, not dominance. The lover becomes capable of receiving without needing to merge. The inner child discovers she can feel safety even in the absence of external guarantees. Emotional entanglement loosens its hold, not through distance, but through presence. The field between two beings transforms as well. Space opens, not as separation, but as recognition of distinct centers meeting. Projection softens. Response is no longer reactive, but reflective. Awareness of the shadow allows desire to move freely without suffocation. And attachment becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Fear no longer dictates the architecture of closeness. It becomes a messenger, whispering truths long ignored. Individuation is a river that moves quietly through this interior landscape. It does not declare arrival. It flows through the recognition of what was projected, the acknowledgement of what was fused, the reclamation of what had been given away. It courses through the psyche, where the lover, the child, the animus, and the shadow coexist, distinct yet harmonized. And as the river moves, it carries a different kind of energy, not frantic or desperate, but steady, contained, and profoundly alive, a subtle vibration that reconfigures how presence, love, and autonomy can exist together, quietly in the field of consciousness, still unfolding. The quiet thread running through the speech is this: the personality trait that makes loving men step back is not a flaw, a lack of love or neediness in the obvious sense. It is the unconscious fear, attachment, and unintegrated inner dynamics we carry. When fear, the inner child, and unclaimed shadows shape behavior, love becomes fused with survival, projections distort perception, and psychological polarity collapses. Men may step back not from love itself, but from the weight of unprocessed fear and dependency projected onto them. True transformation arises through self-awareness, inner integration, and individuation, reclaiming emotional sovereignty, acknowledging the shadow, and nurturing the inner child and animus. In this presence, love no longer demands survival. Polarity is restored, and connection becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, quiet, grounded, and whole.